Hi guys, it's been a while. We're going to chapter 7 in Bound for Oregon. Okay, let's get started. As we can remember, they crossed a river and they lost the pet calf. So she's experiencing some kind of losses right now. At the end of that chapter, she was really upset, and I think we can kind of relate to her right now because we're going through a lot of stuff ourselves. And so, as a reader, I'm thinking, "Hell, she's going through a lot." Remember, she thought, oh, we must be halfway there. And she found out that she wasn't even partway there. And some of us are kind of feeling that way with our social distancing and staying home. And I kind of relate to her because she can't go anywhere. She can't do anything. She's just doing the same thing day after day. So I kind of see where her life and our life are kind of parallel right now. So let's see what Mary Ellen gets into today. Okay, chapter 7. We left behind the grassy prairies of Kansas and moved into the plains of Nebraska. Here the grass was shorter and the soil more sandy. The occasional clumps of beautiful oak trees we had seen were replaced by sparsely scattered cottonwoods and willows on the banks of the streams. And instead of the sweet sounds of the lark and the mockingbird, we heard only the lone hoot of an owl. Looking over this vast, flat, barren land, the men seemed more keenly aware of the great distance still to be traveled to reach Oregon. They talked about it one evening as the sun was going down. "We need to make more speed," urged Mr. Tedrose, an eager, adventurous young man. He always hated to see the other wagons pass us by. "It is already almost the 1st of June." Sarah Jane's father, a lean, sandy-haired man with ears like handles on one of the farmers on father's pottery jugs, agreed. "With good weather, we ought to be able to make 18 or 20 miles a day." Could you imagine? That's not even getting to Fort Dodge in one day. It's kind of amazing to think that you travel for a day and you have to make camp and you're only 20 miles from home. Mr. Grant nodded, but Father's face was thoughtful. "We must be careful not to push the animals too hard," he cautioned. "We have to keep them in good condition if they are to take us all the way." So our small wagon train pushed ahead. To make better speed, we spent a little less time grazing the stock at noon and didn't stop at night until it was almost dark. The weather now was more favorable. Although we still had occasional rain showers and cold, raw winds, most days we were able to make 15 to 16 miles, according to the guidebook, and once Father said we had gone 20 miles. Sarah Jane liked to walk too, and we soon became friends. Walking along next to our wagon, her straw-colored hair poking out from under her yellow checked sunbonnet, she told me all about her home back in Kentucky. "We lived in a real plantation house made of brick," she said, smiling at the memory, "with a great big front porch and flowers growing everywhere. The kitchen was a separate building out back, and I had a swing in the mulberry tree. Out in the fields her father grew tobacco, corn, and pumpkins, muskmelon and watermelons, and the most wonderful sweet potatoes. But he had slaves to do all the work." That explained it, I thought. The way her father never looked quite comfortable in his rough clothes, his slowness in yoking his oxen and loading up his wagon in the mornings. "My mamma has never washed clothes before," she told me, "or fixed a single meal, but she's been doing right well at it, I think." Could you imagine? Not even knowing how to cook and going out on a prairie? Kind of interesting. "Why did you want to leave your plantation to go out west?" I asked her, puzzled. Sarah Jane's face turned suddenly grave. "It's on account of my baby sister, Luella," she explained. "We lived in low river country, and she kept getting the fever. The doctor told my daddy she wouldn't live to grow up unless we moved." We found very little to look at as the oxen plodded slowly along in the dust. Once we passed an abandoned Indian village, now just a few teepee poles over which buffalo hides had been stretched. Now and then we would come upon a prairie dog town. As far as we could see were piles of mounded earth with holes in the center. The prairie dogs, who looked like fat brown squirrels, seemed to be keeping watch, sitting up on their hind legs next to their holes. When they saw us, they would bark furiously in little yipping voices, then tumble down into their holes. They looked so funny that Sarah and Jane and I burst out laughing. Once in a while, too, we would pass fields dotted with flowers, wild bluebells, buttercups, purple and white lupine, and many others that I could not name. Lavina jumped down from the wagon, and the three of us gathered up armloads of flowers, braided them into wreaths. One afternoon, we placed a wreath on top of Cynthia's short yellow curls. I crown you Queen of the May, pronounced Lavina. Queen May, repeated Cynthia, bouncing up and down and laughing delightedly. For the rest of that day, she wore the drooping circle of flowers like a lopsided crown. Even at bedtime, when Mother tried to take it off, I could hear her protesting, Queen May, Queen May. Little kid doesn't want to have to give up her crown to go to bed. Herds of fleet-footed antelope and buffalo, with their dark hunched shoulders and saggy manes, could sometimes be seen running in the distance. Mr. Grant, who loved to hunt, kept going out after them until he finally succeeded in shooting an antelope. He divided up the meat among the 4 families. It tasted good while it lasted. Like veal, Mother said. Nothing lasted very long at our table anymore, except molasses, of which we had a whole keg. With every meal we traveled, our appetites seemed to grow, and I was always hungry. Fuel for the campfires was growing scarce, and so was good, clear drinking water. As I walked along, I picked up any little twigs I could find for firewood and poked them into the chairs hanging at the back of the wagon. Once I thought I saw, in the distance up ahead, a great shimmering lake surrounded by trees. But as we drew closer, it suddenly disappeared. Where did the lake go? I asked Father. It was not real, he answered. Your lake was just a mirage. Let me stop here for just a second. Some of you have ever traveled on the road, like in when it's hot and you see that shimmer, and then all of a sudden it looks like there's water up overhead. This is kind of what she's seeing. That shimmering kind of look where you think there's water, but there's not. It's a mirage. It's not really there. Sometimes my eyes ache from looking out over those bare, treeless plains in the afternoon sun. But in the evening, when the round red ball of the sun slowly sank in the west, washing land and sky with rosy glow, it was beautiful. One afternoon, I was walking along beside the wagon, my eyes on the ground, searching for twigs. The hot midday sun beat down on my head, making me feel drowsy. The wagon wheels slowly turned. The oxen picked up their feet and put them down. The white wagon top swayed against the bright blue sky, while underneath the milk pail swung back and forth, back and forth. Even Father, sitting high on the spring seat, his shoulders bent and his big whip still, seemed almost asleep. All at once, I heard Rover up ahead start barking. I looked up. Galloping toward us across the flat, dusty plain was a band of Indians. It was the first time in our journey that I had seen Indians up close. As they came closer, I could make out 15 or 20 of them sitting straight on spotted ponies. They were all painted in bright war paint, and some wore headdresses of white eagle feathers that fluttered in the breeze. They looked so strange and wild that my breath caught in my throat and my heart began bumping crazily inside my chest. Dropping my twigs, I scrambled quickly into the back of the wagon. In my haste, my foot kicked the milk pail, and it slopped over. I grabbed Lavina and drew her down so we were both hidden from sight, then pulled the bedclothes over our heads. Now the wagon creaked to a stop. Ahead of us, the Indians were talking to Mr. Grant. But I could not make out their words. Gradually, my pounding heart slowed to its normal beat. Peeping out, I saw one of the Indians, who seemed to be their leader, making gestures with their hands. He was tall and coppery brown and sat straight as a tree trunk. With his dark, glittering eyes and beaked nose, he reminded me of some kind of fierce, painted bird. Go fight crows, he said in a deep, harsh voice, another Indian pointing off in the distance. I think they are trying to tell us that they have no quarrel with the whites, said Father in a low voice. Cynthia was awake now and was starting to whimper. Shh, Mother whispered, rocking her. Up ahead there was more confusing talk and more signs. Then, abruptly, the Indians were gone. I watched them gallop away until at last they became just far-off puffs of dust. Even as relief washed over me, I felt a little twinge of shame. If Grandma had been here, she would not have been afraid. She would not have spilled the milk and hidden herself away under the bedclothes. I knew Grandma. She would have drawn herself up and looked the big Indian right in the eye. I was not the only one who had been frightened. How was not the only one who had I was not the only one who had been frightened. However, that night an uneasy feeling hung over our camp. The men talked in low voices. The women wore worried looks as they prepared the evening meal. Cynthia fussed more than usual, clinging to Mother's skirts. And although I tried hard not to, I found myself looking over my shoulder at the slightest noise. The stories we had heard about Indians and war paint were true. Maybe those were other stories about stealing horses and massacring whites. White families were also true. Father tried to calm our fears. All those terrible tales we have been hearing are exaggerated, he told Lavina and me. Most Indians, like the cause we saw today, are peaceful toward the white people, and most wagon trains are not bothered by them. But the Indians do have reason to be unhappy, you know. All this country once belonged to them. For years, the whites have been crowding them out. They have killed their buffalo and taken their land. They have not treated them with fairness. Thinking about Indians in this way made me feel more kindly toward them and less frightened. Still, in the black stillness of the midnight, when I heard wolves howl and Rover answer with his low, rumbling growl, I couldn't help remembering those stories and wondering if Indians were creeping up on our camp in the darkness. Once in a while, Sarah Jane and I were allowed to ride John and David Grant's horses. This made a nice change of the monotony of our days. Of course, Mother insisted on my riding side saddle with my long, full skirt down over my ankles. It's the only way for a young lady to ride, she said firmly. I thought about how John sat on his horse, his head low, his legs locked around Polly's sides as he urged her to a gallop, and I opened my mouth to protest, but Father was looking at me. Mary Ellen, he began, with a warning frown. So I said nothing, although inside I was simmering with resentment. I rode side saddle.